but I knew I had to keep it together for her. When I arrived at the wedding venue, everything looked perfect. The sun was shining, the flowers were in full bloom, and there was a sense of joy in the air. Everyone was excited, ready to celebrate love and new beginnings. I, on the other hand, was just trying to hold back tears. I didn't want anyone to know what was going on. I wanted this day to be about my friend, not me. I went straight to the dressing room where the other bridesmaids were getting ready. They were laughing, chatting, and helping the bride with last-minute touches. I smiled and joined in, but my heart wasn't in it. Every time I looked in the mirror, all I could see was someone who had just lost everything. But I kept smiling because that's what you do at weddings, you smile. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I stood next to my best friend as she walked down the aisle, her face glowing with happiness. She looked at her soon-to-be husband with so much love in her eyes, and for a moment, I forgot about my own pain. I was genuinely happy for her. She deserved this. She deserved the fairy tale, the happily ever after. And I was honored to be there for her on her special day. But as the vows were exchanged, my emotions started to come back. I couldn't help but think about my own marriage and how it had once felt like a fairy tale too. I remembered standing at the altar with my ex-husband, promising to love each other forever. Back then, we believed we could conquer anything together. But life had other plans. The reception was even harder. Weddings are meant to be a time of celebration, full of love, laughter, and dancing. But for me, it was like living in two worlds at once. On the outside, I was dancing with the other bridesmaids, laughing with old friends and taking pictures. But inside, I was grieving the end of my marriage. The contrast was overwhelming, and I felt like I was barely holding it together. At one point, I stepped outside to get some air. I stood there, looking up at the stars, and let myself cry for a few minutes. It wasn't a full breakdown, just a quiet release of the sadness I had been holding in all day. I didn't want anyone to see me like that, especially not my best friend. This was her day, and I wasn't going to let my own heartache take anything away from her happiness. As the night went on, I went back inside and did my best to enjoy the evening. I took photos, made toasts, and danced some more. It was one of the most surreal experiences of my life, celebrating love while feeling the pain of love lost. But I pushed through, reminding myself that this was just one day. Tomorrow would be different. After the wedding, I headed back to my sister's house, completely drained. I couldn't believe how much had changed in just one day. That morning, I was still married, still holding onto the idea that maybe things could work out. By that evening, I was a bridesmaid at a wedding, pretending everything was fine while my own world had just collapsed. When I finally crawled into bed that night, I let out a deep sigh. It felt like the weight of the day was pressing down on me, and all I could do was lie there and try to process everything. I didn't have any answers, and I didn't know what my next step would be. But I knew I had made the right decision to leave. I knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, even if it felt like the end. The wedding was a strange mix of emotions for me, joy for my friend, sadness for myself, and hope for the future. I realized that life doesn't stop for our pain. It keeps moving, and we have to move with it. That night, as I lay in bed, I told myself that I would get through this, that I would be okay. It wouldn't be easy, but I had made it through the day, and that was enough for now. Looking back, I'm glad I went to that wedding. It reminded me that even in the darkest times, there's still light. Even when one part of life ends, another part begins. And sometimes, it's the hardest days that teach us how strong we really are. The days and weeks following the separation were some of the hardest I had ever faced. After the whirlwind of emotions on the day my marriage ended, I thought I'd feel some sense of relief. In a way, I did. There was a small comfort in knowing that the tension, the constant fighting, and the pretending were over. But that didn't make the pain go away. The reality of being on my own started to sink in, and it hit me harder than I ever imagined. I moved in with my sister for a while, and while she was incredibly supportive, I felt lost. I had been with my ex-husband for over a decade, and now I was alone. Every day, I woke up feeling like something was missing, like a part of me was suddenly gone. Even though I knew deep down that our separation was the right choice, it didn't make the feelings of loss any easier. What made it even harder was being away from my kids. We had agreed to share custody, but not seeing them every day felt like a piece of my heart had been ripped out. I had spent so much of my life being their mom, taking care of them, and making sure they had everything they needed. Now, suddenly, there were days when I wouldn't see them at all. The silence in those moments was deafening. I missed their laughter, their energy, even the little messes they would make around the house. The quiet of my sister's guest room made it hard for me to escape my thoughts. During the day, I kept myself busy with work. Being an accountant gave me some sense of normalcy. I could focus on numbers and spreadsheets, things that didn't change, things that were predictable. But at night, when I was alone, the feelings came rushing back. I would lie in bed and think about everything, how my marriage had started with so much love and hope, and how it had slowly unraveled over the years. I thought about the small moments that had added up, the arguments, the misunderstandings, the times we stopped communicating. There were nights when I wondered if I had done enough to save the marriage, if maybe I had given up too easily. But deep down, I knew that we were both different people now. We had grown apart, and no amount of trying could have changed that. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding. It wasn't easy. I had to start thinking of myself not as a wife anymore, but as someone who was on her own. I had to learn how to be independent again, to figure out who I was outside of the marriage. For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in being a wife and a mother. Now, I had to rediscover what it meant to just be me. I chose to leave my marriage, and it was the hardest but best decision of my life. I need to confess, 15 years have passed since the day my marriage came to an end, but the memories of that day still linger in my mind. It wasn't the first time my ex-husband and I had argued, but it was the first time that everything we'd been avoiding came to the surface. Looking back now, I can see how the signs were there for years, but I ignored them, holding on to the hope that we could make things work. We had been together for 11 years, 3 years of dating and 8 years of marriage. I thought we were unbreakable, but the reality was we were drifting apart. We had 2 beautiful children, our daughter, who was 7, and our son, who was 4 at the time. I loved being a mom and felt that my world revolved around them. I also had a demanding job as an accountant, and finding balance between work and home was challenging. My ex-husband, on the other hand, was trying to build his career as a graphic designer, but things weren't going as smoothly for him. His freelance work was inconsistent, and the pressure of our financial situation began to weigh heavily on both of us. The tension between us had been building for a while. Small arguments became more frequent, and moments of peace were few and far between. I could sense that something was wrong, but I wasn't ready to face it. I kept telling myself that every couple goes through rough patches, that we would eventually find our way back to each other. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Then came the day that changed everything. We were arguing again, though I can't even remember what it was about. Our fights had become so common that they all blended together. But this time, something was different. My ex-husband looked at me with a tired, defeated expression and asked, "Do you even care about us anymore?" That question hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had been burying my feelings, pretending that everything was fine. I didn't want to hurt him, didn't want to break up our family. But when he asked me that, I realized I couldn't keep hiding the truth. I didn't have an answer for him, at least not one that would make things better. Instead, his words unlocked something inside me that I had been trying to ignore for years. "I don't know," I said quietly. "I don't know if I care about us anymore." The look on his face was one of shock, as if he hadn't expected me to admit it. To be honest, I hadn't expected it either. But once the words were out, there was no going back. I had been holding onto this weight for so long, and finally, it was out in the open. We stood there in silence for a moment, both of us unsure of what to say next. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew that this was the turning point. There was no fixing this. Our marriage had reached the end. "I think we need to separate," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't argue. He didn't yell or try to convince me otherwise. He simply nodded, as if he had been waiting for me to say those words all along. I think we both knew that this was inevitable. We had been growing apart for years, becoming different people, and there was no way to bridge the gap between us. The rest of that day is a blur. I remember packing a bag, calling my sister, and asking if I could stay with her for the night. She didn't ask any questions, just told me to come over. I grabbed a few things and left the house, feeling numb. I knew this was the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. What made the day even stranger was that my best friend was getting married that evening, and I was a bridesmaid in her wedding. I had committed to being there months before, and despite the chaos in my personal life, I knew I couldn't back out. So I went to her wedding, put on my bridesmaid dress, and stood by her side as she said her vows. It was one of the most surreal experiences of my life, celebrating someone else's love while mine was falling apart. I smiled for the cameras, congratulated the happy couple, and danced with the other bridesmaids. But inside, I was broken. The contrast between the joy of the wedding and the sadness I was feeling was overwhelming. It felt like I was living two different lives, one where I was pretending everything was fine, and another where my world was crumbling. That night, as I lay in my sister's guest room, I felt the weight of everything finally hit me. The house I had shared with my ex-husband no longer felt like my home. The life we had built together was gone, and I didn't know what came next. I was scared, confused, and heartbroken. But even in that dark moment, there was a small part of me that felt relief. The truth was out, and I didn't have to pretend anymore. I knew it would be a long road ahead, but I also knew that I had made the right choice. Our marriage wasn't working, and it was time to let go. The days and months that followed were difficult, but this was just the beginning of my journey to rediscovering myself. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to start a new chapter in my life, one where I would find strength, happiness, and love again. For now, though, all I could do was take it one day at a time. And that was enough. The day my marriage ended was one of the hardest days of my life. But as strange as it sounds, that same day I had to attend a wedding. It wasn't just any wedding either. It was my best friend's wedding, and I was a bridesmaid. It was one of those situations where life throws you into a whirlwind of emotions, and you have no choice but to go through it. I still remember sitting in my car, parked in front of my sister's house after I left home. My bags were in the back seat, and my heart felt heavy. The argument with my ex-husband played over and over in my mind. There was no going back now. We both knew it was the end, and I had already told him I needed space. That space was now a reality, and it scared me. But no matter how heartbroken I felt, there was still something I had to do. My best friend was getting married, and I had promised her months ago that I would be there. I couldn't break that promise, not on her big day. I didn't want to bring any drama into her celebration, but the thought of standing by her side while my own world was falling apart was almost too much to bear. As I sat there in the car, I took a few deep breaths. I told myself, you can do this. You'll get through today, and tomorrow you'll figure everything else out. It felt like I was putting on a mask, pretending to be happy when, on the inside, I felt shattered. One of the hardest parts was figuring out a new routine. When the kids were with me, things felt somewhat normal. I'd cook dinner for them, help them with their homework, and tuck them into bed like I always had. But when they weren't with me, I felt lost. I didn't know what to do with myself. The house was too quiet, and time seemed to drag on. There were days when I couldn't even bring myself to make a real meal because it felt strange to cook just for one. My sister did her best to help me, but I knew I couldn't rely on her forever. After a few months, I decided it was time to find my own place. I wanted to create a new home for myself and my kids, a space that was just ours. I found a small apartment not far from their school, and while it wasn't the biggest or fanciest place, it felt right. It felt like a fresh start. Moving into the apartment was both exciting and terrifying. It was the first time I had lived on my own in years, and part of me wasn't sure if I could handle it. But the other part of me was ready for the challenge. I knew I had to take control of my life and start moving forward. Slowly, I began to create new routines. I focused on making the apartment feel like home, decorating it with pictures of the kids and adding little touches that made the space feel warm and inviting. I got into the habit of going for walks in the evenings, enjoying the quiet time to think and clear my mind. I also started reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in a while. They were my lifeline during this time, offering me the support and comfort I desperately needed. Work became a big part of my healing process, too. Being an accountant gave me a sense of purpose and control, especially when so much of my life felt uncertain. I took on more clients, kept busy, and tried to keep my mind focused on the future. Slowly but surely, I started to feel a little more like myself again. But the road to healing wasn't a straight line. There were setbacks, moments when I felt overwhelmed by loneliness or doubt. Some days I questioned if I had made the right choices, if maybe I should have tried harder to make my marriage work. There were nights when I cried myself to sleep, wondering how my life had ended up here. But even on those tough days, I reminded myself that this was part of the process. Healing takes time, and I couldn't expect everything to be okay overnight. The hardest part of the aftermath wasn't the day-to-day tasks of living alone or figuring out a new routine. It was learning to let go of the guilt. For a long time, I carried a weight on my shoulders, feeling like I had failed. But as time passed, I started to understand that letting go of the marriage wasn't a failure. It was an act of courage. It was about accepting that sometimes, even when you love someone, the best thing you can do is let them go. In those quiet moments when I doubted myself, I learned to show myself grace. I reminded myself that I was doing my best, and that was enough. Little by little, the sadness began to lift, and I started to see a new future for myself, a future that was bright, even if it was different from what I had once imagined. The aftermath of my divorce was filled with challenges, but it was also filled with growth. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I learned to stand on my own and build a life that was truly mine. After the dust began to settle following my divorce, I found myself in a strange place, both physically and emotionally. My new apartment was small but cozy, and it was the first space that was truly mine. It didn't feel like home at first. I missed the big family house, the noise of my kids playing in the backyard, and the familiarity of the life I had left behind. But I knew that this was my chance to start fresh, and I needed to make the most of it. In the beginning, I focused on making the apartment feel like a place where my kids would feel comfortable when they stayed with me. I hung up their artwork on the walls, arranged their toys in neat little corners, and made sure their bedrooms were filled with things that made them happy. Their laughter and presence brought life to the space whenever they were with me. But when they weren't, the silence felt almost unbearable. I had always thought of myself as a strong person, but this was the first time I had to stand on my own 2 feet without someone by my side. It was a scary realization, but also an empowering one. I knew that I had to rediscover who I was, not as a wife or a mother, but as a person. I had been so focused on being everything for everyone else that I had lost sight of myself. Now, it was time to find me again. The first step was reconnecting with old friends. Over the years, I had drifted away from many of them. Life had gotten busy, and I had been so caught up in my marriage, my kids, and work that I hadn't made much time for friendships. But now, I knew that I needed those connections more than ever. So, I started reaching out, sending texts, making phone calls, and setting up coffee dates. To my surprise, my friends welcomed me back with open arms. They didn't hold it against me that I had been absent for so long. They just wanted to support me as I went through this transition. Spending time with them reminded me of the person I used to be, the one who laughed easily, enjoyed silly conversations, and didn't always have to be responsible for everything. It was like rediscovering a part of myself that had been buried under years of stress and responsibility. My friends were there to lift me up, and slowly, I started to feel more like myself again. Along with reconnecting with friends, I also started picking up hobbies that I had long forgotten. Before I became a wife and mother, I used to love painting. It wasn't something I ever did professionally, but it brought me joy. So, I dusted off my old paints and brushes, set up a small easel in the corner of my living room, and began creating again. The act of painting was therapeutic. It gave me a way to express myself and work through my emotions in a way that words couldn't. As I mixed colors and stroked the canvas, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. Another thing that helped me find myself again was exercise. I had always enjoyed going for walks, but during my marriage, I had often been too busy or too tired to make it a regular habit. Now that I had more time on my hands, I made a point to go for a walk every evening after work. It became a time for me to clear my head, enjoy the fresh air, and focus on the present. I woke up disoriented and unsure of the time, feeling the weight of another day pressing down on me. It was strange. There was a time when I rose with the sun, full of energy and excitement for the day ahead. Now, the sleeping pills had completely disrupted my internal clock, leaving me in a haze of confusion. But at least I was in my own room, in my own bed, not the guest room. That small detail felt like a victory in my new reality. Keeping my eyes shut, I resisted the urge to face the day. I had developed a morning ritual, one that brought me a semblance of comfort amidst the chaos. I prayed, God, please let today be a turning point for me, not just another step toward the end. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I could pretend that nothing had changed, that these last 6 months had been a bad dream. I imagined Thomas, my husband, rolling over and asking, "What's wrong?" I could hear his warm voice as if he were right beside me. I would tell him about my dreams, and he would wrap his arms around me, his embrace a fortress against the world. "Nothing can tear us apart," he would say, and I would believe him. But today I heard nothing. The silence pressed in on me, and I listened intently for the sound of the shower. Thomas had a routine of long, indulgent showers, emerging with his hair slicked back, smelling of citrus body wash. He would lean over, give me a gentle kiss, and smile, unbothered by my morning breath. Yet today, there was no shower, no rustling sheets, just stillness. He could still be asleep, or maybe he had already left for work. As long as I kept my eyes closed, I could pretend that everything was still normal, that our lives hadn't spiraled out of control. But I couldn't stay cocooned in bed forever. Some days I could drift back to sleep, but today felt different. Finally, the moment came when I had to confront reality. I took a deep breath and opened my eyes. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, bathing the room in a soft glow. I squinted, still disoriented, and glanced at the clock on Thomas's nightstand. It was just out of reach, but I had to know. Rolling over, I was met with an empty side of the bed, the sheets neatly tucked in, a stark reminder of his absence. He hadn't returned. Rather than my dream coming true, my nightmare continued. With a heavy heart, I got up and dressed, trying to flit about the house, doing small tasks that felt meaningless. The sound of the mail truck outside reminded me that it had been days since I had checked the mailbox. Even though it was just a few steps across the street, some days that felt like an insurmountable task. Gathering the pile of mail, I noticed the usual bills and advertisements, but one envelope caught my eye. It was white, with Thomas's loopy handwriting on it. He had written me a letter. Could this be the answer to my prayers? After all this time, he probably didn't know what to say. Writing made sense. It gave him time to gather his thoughts. With trembling hands, I ripped the envelope open and pulled out the papers. As I read the first line, a wave of nausea washed over me, and I felt myself sliding down the wall, screaming in disbelief. 34 years, 2 months, 16 days, 1 hour, and 12 minutes ago, I had walked down the aisle of the First Baptist Church, my father's arm linked with mine, while Thomas stood at the altar, waiting for me. We had chosen the traditional vows over writing our own. From this day forward, until death do us part. I had never been so certain of anything in my life as I was about marrying Thomas. Waiting until marriage had been an old-fashioned notion. I wore white in every sense of the word. I loved that I had saved myself for him. He couldn't say the same, but that was all right. He was a man, after all. There were always women throwing themselves at him, even after we were married. I accepted that his foot might slip now and then, as long as he always came home to me. That was what mattered. But now, after almost 35 years of better and worse, of sickness and health, it was all over. Not by death, which would have felt more natural, but through a piece of paper, the petition for dissolution of marriage. My hands shook so badly as I read the document that it was a miracle I could decipher the words. Clara Evans and Thomas Parker had become the petitioner and respondent. The paper stated that irreconcilable differences had arisen between us, leading to an irretrievable breakdown of our marriage. Any past attempts at reconciliation had failed, and future efforts would be impractical and not in the best interest of either party. What married couple doesn't have differences? They weren't irreconcilable. I didn't remember any past attempts at reconciliation, so how could they claim future attempts would fail? I had not married to get divorced. When I swore before God, I meant it, until death do us part. I got married at 18 and had just turned 53 last birthday. I had nearly been married twice. When our son, David, was little, I would wake up early to prepare breakfast for both him and Thomas. I never settled for the grab-and-go lifestyle. In our home, it was always a feast, ham and eggs, pancakes and sausage, or homemade waffles on weekends. We would quiz David on his times tables or listen to him recite his memorized passages. After breakfast, I'd send my 2 boys off into the world, knowing I had done my best for them. Everything made sense back then. But after David left for college, Thomas didn't want me to fix breakfast for him anymore. I have to watch my carbs and cholesterol, he said, brushing off my efforts. He began leaving for work right after his shower, sometimes not returning until late at night. The rare moments when we actually sat down together for dinner became few and far between. I cherished those times. For nearly 35 years, I had dedicated my life to caring for Thomas and raising David. I had defined myself solely as David's mother and Thomas's wife. I didn't know how to be anyone else. Sitting there on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of my life, I realized that I had to face the truth. I needed to find my way back to myself, to rediscover who Clara Evans was beyond being a wife and mother. And as I contemplated my next steps, I felt a flicker of determination rising within me. I was ready to reclaim my life, to step into the unknown and embrace whatever came next. I wasn't sure how long I sat on the floor, surrounded by the harsh reality of the divorce papers. My thoughts drifted between disbelief and anger, and the ache in my chest felt almost unbearable. But then, as if the universe knew I was at my breaking point, the phone rang. I loved the feeling of my body moving, the rhythm of my steps, and the peacefulness of being outside. Those walks became an important part of my routine, a time just for me. As I spent more time with myself, I realized how important it was to take care of my own well-being. For so many years, I had put everyone else's needs above my own, my kids, my husband, my job. But now, I understood that in order to be the best version of myself, I needed to prioritize my own happiness and health. This didn't mean I stopped caring for others. It just meant that I learned how to care for myself too. During this period of rediscovery, I also worked on building my confidence. It wasn't easy at first. After all, I had spent years feeling like I wasn't enough, like I had failed in my marriage. But with each small step I took, whether it was completing a new painting, making a new friend, or simply managing a challenging day at work, I started to feel stronger. I started to believe in myself again. I realized that I didn't need anyone else to validate my worth. I could find that within myself. Work also became a source of strength for me during this time. Being an accountant gave me a sense of stability and control, especially when so much in my personal life had been uncertain. I threw myself into my work, taking on new clients and challenging projects. The more I accomplished, the more confident I became. I was proving to myself that I could handle anything that came my way, both in my professional life and in my personal one. Of course, there were still moments of doubt and sadness. There were days when I missed the life I had once imagined for myself, when I wondered if things could have turned out differently. But those moments became fewer and farther between. Instead of focusing on what I had lost, I began to focus on what I was gaining: new experiences, new friendships, and most importantly, a new sense of self. Finding myself again wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a gradual process, one that took time and patience. But with each passing day, I felt a little more grounded, a little more sure of who I was and where I was headed. I started to see my divorce not as a failure, but as an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to become the person I was always meant to be. Looking back now, I can see that those months of rediscovery were some of the most important in my life. They were the foundation for the next chapter, one where I was no longer defined by my past, but by the strength and resilience I had found within myself. As time passed, I found myself in a place of peace. It had taken me a while to get there, but after rediscovering who I was and finding joy in my own company, I felt ready for whatever life had to offer. I wasn't searching for love. In fact, the thought of dating again hadn't crossed my mind. My focus had been on rebuilding myself and creating a happy life for my children. But as life often does, it surprised me when I least expected it. It started with a casual conversation. I met him through a mutual friend during a group outing. We were at a small cafe, and I remember noticing how kind and genuine he seemed. We talked about everything and nothing, just simple, light-hearted conversation. There was something about him that made me feel at ease, like I didn't have to put up any walls or pretend to be someone I wasn't. He asked about my work, my kids, and my interests, and he genuinely seemed interested in getting to know me. At the end of that first meeting, we exchanged phone numbers. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was nice to meet someone new, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to open my heart again. I had spent so long healing from the past, and part of me was afraid of getting hurt again. But something about him made me want to take that risk. Over the next few weeks, we began texting each other here and there. It was nothing serious at first, just friendly messages and the occasional laugh. But as we continued to talk, I found myself looking forward to his texts. They brightened my day and made me smile in a way I hadn't in a long time. It felt easy, natural, and safe. Then one day, he asked if I wanted to grab coffee again. I hesitated at first, wondering if I was truly ready. But in the end, I said yes. We met at the same cafe where we had first talked, and from the moment we sat down, the conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about our lives, our dreams, and the things that mattered most to us. I told him about my kids, about my journey since the divorce, and he listened with understanding and empathy. As the days went by, we continued to meet up, each time feeling more comfortable around each other. It wasn't long before I realized that I had developed feelings for him. It scared me at first. Falling in love again was something I didn't think would happen so soon. But with him, everything felt different. It wasn't like the whirlwind romance I had experienced in my first marriage. This was steady, calm, and genuine. He was patient with me, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. He understood that I had been through a lot and that opening up again would take time. But the more time we spent together, the more I trusted him. He made me feel seen and valued in a way I hadn't felt in years. With him, there were no games, no drama, just kindness, respect, and honesty. One of the moments that stands out most to me was the day I introduced him to my children. I had been cautious about bringing anyone new into their lives, but I felt in my heart that this was the right time. I wanted to make sure that whoever I let into my world would also be someone who cared about my kids. After all, they were the most important part of my life. We planned a simple outing to the park. I was nervous, unsure of how my kids would react, but as soon as we got there, he was great with them. He played soccer with my son, pushed my daughter on the swings, and genuinely enjoyed spending time with them. The way he interacted with them melted my heart. It wasn't forced or awkward. It felt natural, like he belonged there with us. That day at the park was a turning point for me. It was when I realized that this wasn't just a fling or a short-lived romance. It was something real, something lasting. My kids liked him, and more importantly, I trusted him with my heart. As our relationship deepened, we talked about our future. He told me he loved me, and when he said those words, I knew he meant them. It wasn't just about the way he said it, it was about the way he had treated me from the very beginning. He had been patient, kind, and supportive. He never tried to rush me or pressure me into anything. He let me take the lead and allowed our relationship to grow naturally. In time, we decided to take the next step and move in together. It wasn't a decision we made lightly. We both knew how much it would change things for us and for the kids, but we also knew that we were ready. We had built a strong foundation of trust and love, and we felt confident that we could create a happy, blended family. Blending our families wasn't without its challenges, of course. There were moments when my kids felt unsure or struggled with the idea of sharing their mom with someone new. But we took it slow, making sure that they always felt loved and secure. He was patient with them, never trying to take over or replace their father, but simply being there for them as a friend and a positive presence in their lives. In the end, our family dynamic worked. It wasn't always perfect, but it was filled with love and understanding. My kids grew to love him, and together, we created a home that was full of laughter and joy. Looking back now, I realize how unexpected this chapter of my life was. I never imagined that I would find love again, especially after going through such a painful divorce. But life has a way of surprising us, often in the most beautiful ways. This new relationship taught me that love doesn't have to be rushed or forced. It can come quietly, when you least expect it, and it can be stronger and more meaningful than anything you've ever known before. Finding love again didn't erase the pain of my past, but it showed me that there is always hope for a new beginning. Life moves forward, and with it, so does love. Blending two families is not an easy task. When my new partner and I decided to move in together, we knew there would be challenges. But we also knew that with love, patience, and understanding, we could make it work. The day we brought our families together under one roof marked the beginning of a new chapter in our lives, one that would test us, but also bring so much joy. At first, everything was exciting and new. My kids, now a little older, were curious about the changes, but also nervous. They had been used to just having me around, and now they had to share me with someone else. I knew it would take time for them to adjust, so I tried to be as patient as possible. I made sure they knew that my love for them hadn't changed. In fact, my love for them grew even stronger as we navigated this new phase of life together. My partner was amazing through it all. He never tried to take the place of their father, something I deeply appreciated. He knew that my kids already had a dad, and he respected that role. Instead, he focused on building his own relationship with them slowly and carefully. He made it clear that he was there for them, not to replace anyone, but to add more love and support to their lives. In the beginning, there were some tough moments. My daughter, who was about 10 at the time, had a harder time adjusting than my son. She was used to having me all to herself when we were home. Now, she had to share my attention with another person, and that wasn't easy for her. I remember one evening when she came to me in tears, saying she missed the way things used to be when it was just the two of us. It broke my heart to see her struggle, but I knew this was part of the process. I hugged her tight and told her that no matter what, she would always have a special place in my heart. I reassured her that my love for her wouldn't change just because someone new was in our lives. We talked it through, and I promised her that I would always make time for us to have one-on-one moments. She needed that reassurance, and from that day on, I made it a point to keep that promise. My son, on the other hand, was a bit more relaxed about the whole situation. He was younger and a little more adaptable. He and my partner bonded over things like sports and video games, and they quickly developed a friendship. It was heartwarming to see them play together, laugh, and genuinely enjoy each other's company. My son liked having someone around who could throw a football with him or take him to the park. As time went on, the kids began to settle into this new rhythm. We created new routines as a family, finding a balance that worked for everyone. Weekends became special times when we would go on outings together, whether it was a trip to the zoo, a hike in the park, or just a simple family movie night at home. These moments brought us closer together and helped create a sense of unity. Of course, there were still challenges along the way. Blending a family doesn't happen overnight, and there were times when the kids would get frustrated or feel unsure about their place in this new family dynamic. There were moments when they missed the old way of life, and that was perfectly normal. I understood that it wasn't easy for them, and my partner and I always made sure to talk openly with them about how they were feeling. Communication became key during this time. We encouraged the kids to express their emotions, whether they were happy, sad, or frustrated. We wanted them to feel like they had a voice in this new family, and we always listened to their concerns. Sometimes, all they needed was a little extra attention or reassurance that things were going to be okay. Other times, they just needed space to adjust. One thing that helped a lot was maintaining some of the old traditions we had before moving in together. For example, every Sunday, the kids and I would make breakfast together. Pancakes were our favorite, and even after we moved in with my partner, we kept that tradition alive. It gave the kids something familiar to hold on to, something that reminded them of the bond we had before everything changed. At the same time, we started creating new traditions as a blended family. One of my favorite new traditions was our Friday night game nights. We would sit around the table, play board games, and eat pizza. It was a simple thing, but it brought so much laughter and joy to our home. The kids loved it, and it gave us all something to look forward to at the end of the week. Blending our families also meant navigating relationships with my ex-husband. Co-parenting was an ongoing process, and while it wasn't always easy, we made it work for the sake of the kids. My ex and I had established a good routine for sharing custody, and my partner respected those boundaries. We kept communication open and always made decisions based on what was best for the kids. My partner also respected that the kids needed their time with their father. He never tried to step into that role, and I think that's part of what made the transition smoother for everyone. He was always supportive and understanding when it came to their relationship with their dad, and that helped build trust between him and the kids. Looking back, I'm grateful for the patience and love my partner showed throughout this journey. Blending families is never easy, but with time, we found our way. We weren't perfect, and there were bumps along the road, but we became a family in our own way. We learned that family isn't just about who's related by blood, it's about the love, care, and support you give each other. Now, when I see my kids and my partner together, laughing and sharing moments, I feel so thankful. We may have come from different places, but we created a new kind of family, one built on love, respect, and understanding. And while it wasn't always easy, it was worth every challenge. Our blended family may look different than what I once imagined, but it's filled with more love than I could have ever hoped for. As time went by, our blended family found its rhythm. It wasn't perfect, and there were still days when things felt a little complicated. But more often than not, our home was filled with laughter and love. The kids had grown used to this new life, and while the transition had its ups and downs, we had all come a long way. One of the most important things I learned during this journey was that it takes time to create a new sense of normal. Blending families isn't something that happens quickly. It's a gradual process that requires patience, understanding, and a lot of love. My partner and I had both made mistakes along the way, but we never gave up. We were committed to making it work, not just for ourselves, but for the kids too. A few years passed, and we reached a significant milestone. Our youngest child graduated from high school. It was a big moment for all of us. We had been through so much together, and now here we were, watching the kids grow up and start their own journeys. I remember the day of the graduation so clearly. My ex-husband, my partner, and I all sat together, proud of what our child had accomplished. It wasn't always easy to co-parent, but by this point, we had figured out how to make it work. My ex-husband and I had learned to put our differences aside for the sake of the kids. We didn't always agree on everything, but we respected each other's role in their lives. My partner, too, had been amazing through it all. He never tried to step into the place of their father, and that made things smoother for everyone. That day at the graduation ceremony was a reminder of how far we had come. There we were, all of us sitting together, watching our child take that big step into adulthood. It wasn't just a celebration of our child's hard work, it was a celebration of everything we had worked toward as a family. We had made it through the challenges of blending two families, and now we could see the results of our effort and love. After the ceremony, we all went out for dinner. My ex-husband joined us, and while it might have felt strange for some people, it felt normal for us. We had created a relationship built on mutual respect and understanding. Our conversations were lighthearted, and the kids were happy. Seeing everyone together, enjoying each other's company, filled me with a sense of peace. We weren't just two separate families anymore. We had become something more. Looking back on those years, I realized how much had changed. The days of uncertainty, fear, and doubt had faded. In their place was a life filled with love, hope, and togetherness. I was grateful for the lessons I had learned along the way. The hardest parts of the journey had made me stronger, more patient, and more understanding. And while there were times when I questioned if I was doing the right thing, I now knew that we had all ended up exactly where we needed to be. Of course, not every day was perfect. Life still had its challenges, and our family, like any other, had moments of frustration and disagreement. But we had learned how to work through those moments, how to talk to each other, and how to keep moving forward. We had built a foundation of trust and love that helped us get through the tough times. One of the things I had always worried about was whether my kids would feel torn between two families, mine and their dad's. But as they got older, I realized that they didn't see it that way. They didn't feel like they had to choose between us. Instead, they saw that they were loved and supported by both their father and me, as well as by my partner. That was the most important thing to them, and that's what mattered. As the years went on, I also grew closer to my partner's children. At first, it had been a little awkward. They were teenagers when we first met, and teenagers can be hard to get to know. But over time, we developed a bond. I didn't try to be their mother, just like my partner hadn't tried to be a father to my kids. I was simply there for them, offering support and guidance when they needed it. And in return, they welcomed me into their lives. We became a real family, not because we were related by blood, but because we chose to love and care for one another. One of the biggest lessons I learned throughout this journey is that family is about more than just biology. Family is about the people who stand by you, who love you, and who support you through all of life's challenges. It's about the connections you build, the memories you make, and the love you share. Moving forward as a blended family wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. We had created something special, something that worked for us, even if it didn't look like a traditional family. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As my partner and I moved into the next phase of our lives, with the kids growing up and starting their own paths, we reflected on everything we had been through. We had built a life together, not just as a couple, but as a family. And that's something we were both incredibly proud of. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this. Life may not always turn out the way you planned, but that doesn't mean it won't turn out beautiful. You may go through tough times, but those challenges can lead you to a place of greater happiness and love than you ever imagined. Blending a family isn't easy, but with patience, understanding, and love, it can create something truly special. Now, as I look toward the future, I feel hopeful and at peace. We may not have been a typical family, but we were a family. We were stronger together, and that's something I'll always cherish. Our journey may have been full of twists and turns, but it brought us to a place of love and connection that I wouldn't trade for anything. Moving forward together, I know we'll continue to face whatever comes our way with the same love and strength that got us through everything before. What we can learn from this story. When we look at the complex nature of relationships, especially when they end in divorce, it's easy to make judgments from the outside. We see a marriage fall apart and naturally wonder why. People often rush to find fault, to point fingers, or to assign blame. But what we often overlook is that in the dissolution of a relationship, especially from the perspective of the woman involved, there is a story of immense courage, growth, and self-discovery. From an outside point of view, it's important to remember that no one walks away from a long-term relationship, especially a marriage, lightly. Society often tends to place a burden on women to hold the family together, to always be the nurturer, the caregiver, the one who sacrifices for the greater good of the household. But what happens when, after years of trying, that sacrifice leads to losing herself? It's easy to say, she should have tried harder, or she gave up too soon, but we rarely stop to ask ourselves what the cost of staying would have been to her mental, emotional, and even physical well-being. Divorce is seen as a failure by many, but is it really? If a woman has spent years trying to save a marriage that is no longer serving her, if she's exhausted every effort to communicate, to heal, and to nurture a relationship that's run its course, how is her decision to leave a failure? In fact, isn't it a display of strength? To walk away from something familiar, something that once held so much promise, takes more bravery than staying in a situation that's harmful or unfulfilling. It requires a deep understanding of oneself, a recognition of worth that says, "I deserve more." Think about it. This woman, after years of being a wife, a mother, a partner, realizes that the person she's become is no longer compatible with the life she's been living. She's outgrown the dynamics that once worked, or maybe they never truly worked, and she was just doing her best to hold everything together. Over time, she's been living not for herself, but for others. And while there's a beauty in sacrifice, there's also a danger in forgetting your own needs, dreams, and desires. From the outside, we don't see the countless nights she spent in deep reflection, wondering if she was making the right choice. We don't see the internal battle she fought, questioning if she was letting down her children or breaking apart something sacred. It's easy to cast judgment when we only have fragments of the story. But I urge you to think about the weight of the decision to leave a marriage. It's not a choice anyone makes without tremendous thought and emotional strain. It's not about taking the easy way out. It's about survival, about reclaiming one's life. Let's talk about her role as a mother. One might argue that staying together for the sake of the children is the noble thing to do. But what does that really teach them? If they grow up in an environment where their mother is constantly unhappy, where there's tension, lack of communication, or even outright emotional distance between their parents, what kind of model of love and partnership are they witnessing? By choosing to leave, she's not only freeing herself, but she's also showing her children that they deserve relationships that fulfill them, that they should never settle for something that drains their spirit. She's teaching them that it's okay to choose happiness, even when it's difficult. There's also a pervasive belief that women are the emotional glue that holds families together, and when that bond breaks, it's somehow her fault. But this overlooks the fact that relationships are partnerships. Both people have a role to play, and if a marriage fails, it's not because one person alone didn't try hard enough. Relationships require effort from both sides. It's entirely possible that despite her best efforts, the relationship simply couldn't be saved because it takes two people who are committed to growing and working together. Sometimes, people grow in different directions, and that's not anyone's fault. It's just life. By defending the woman's choice to leave, I'm not disregarding the pain and challenges that come with divorce. It's hard for everyone involved. But her decision to walk away isn't an act of selfishness, it's an act of self-preservation. It's about recognizing that she has worth, that her happiness matters, and that she can be a better version of herself and a better mother when she's not tied to something that's causing her pain. We, as outsiders, need to shift our perspective. Instead of viewing divorce as a negative outcome, we should see it as a new beginning. For this woman, it's a chance to rediscover who she is, to pursue her passions, and to show her children that it's okay to make hard decisions if it means living a more authentic life. She's not abandoning her family, she's leading them by example, showing them the importance of personal happiness, the strength in making tough choices, and the value of living truthfully. In conclusion, defending the woman's choice to leave her marriage isn't about disregarding the challenges of divorce. It's about acknowledging the immense strength it takes to step away from something that no longer brings joy or fulfillment. It's about honoring her courage to rebuild her life, not as a wife or partner, but as an individual who knows her worth. We need to stop seeing divorce as a failure and start recognizing it for what it often is, an act of bravery, a step toward reclaiming one's life and happiness. This woman, like so many others, deserves our support, not our judgment.